Hi, everyone. Welcome to the virtual stakeholder workshop. My name is Omar Rascon. I am with the City of Richmond Economic Development, Environmental and Health Initiatives Division. We have NREL. They are here to provide a presentation regarding the sorry, I'm letting people in as they testing. Regarding the Richmond Equitable Existing Buildings Electrification Plan, I will go ahead and hand it on to Allison.
Awesome. Thank you, Omar. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Allison, as Omar said, and my colleague Patrick Gibbs and I work at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. Be prepared, this is the first of several acronyms that you will hear today. NREL is located in Colorado, and we are part of the U.S. Department of Energy's National Laboratory System. So that also includes the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which some of you here may have heard of. Most of the work that I do at NREL is related to workforce development and community-based programs. I've been at NREL about 2 years, and prior to starting at NREL, I worked at Habitat for Humanity for many years. I worked for Grid Alternatives, which I know has done quite a bit of work in Richmond, and I also worked as a city planner, all in Colorado. But I actually am from the Bay Area. I grew up in San Francisco and in the North Bay, and went to school in the East Bay, went to college in the East Bay. So anyway, I'm happy to be here. I'm going to let Patrick introduce himself, and then we'll talk about the project.
Thank you very much, Allison. As Allison said, my name is Patrick Gibbs. I work at NREL as well. A majority of my work at the National Renewable Energy Lab is based on community work. So communities come to NREL, just as Richmond has, to seek assistance in their energy goals. So whether that be what Richmond has looked for in a electrification analysis of their existing buildings, or if city wants to add solar or residential solar, utility scale solar, I help with that. And I've been at the lab for 1.5 years now, and from Colorado, and did my education here in Colorado as well. So thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you, Patrick. If you want to put the slides up on the screen. So what we're here to talk about today is a project that NREL has been working with various Richmond city staff and community members over the last year. And we're calling it the Equitable Electrification Analysis for Existing Buildings in Richmond. It rolls right off the tongue. But you can go ahead to the next slide there. The plan for today is we're going to start with an overview of the project, just a high-level overview, and then really we're going to spend the vast majority of our time on. Let me make sure this is the right. I feel like this is maybe not the right version of the slides. Hold on, we don't have this many minutes. Just a second. Anyway, we'll start with the project overview. We'll spend the bulk of our time on sort of the key findings and the high level outcomes that we found, and then we're really going to try to leave about 30 minutes at the end for discussion. We want to hear feedback and reactions from everyone that's here today. We do have time built in periodically for questions. So as we're talking, if something that we say doesn't make sense, which is entirely possible, go ahead and put your question in the chat, and we will get to it sort of at the end of that section. And Omar, if you can help us monitor that chat, that would be super helpful. If there's a question that feels really pressing, we may get to it there, but otherwise we'll get to it at the time for questions. So Patrick, if you want to try sharing your screen again. Cool, beautiful, awesome. Okay, so you can go ahead to the next slide. So as I said, I'm going to start with an overview. Yep, that's perfect. So back in 2021, just some background on what got us here today. A couple of years ago, the city of Richmond, in coordination with the Richmond Community Foundation, applied to this Communities Leap program, which is a Department of Energy funded program that's intended to provide technical assistance to communities that are interested in sort of supporting local economic empowerment through clean energy projects. The city of Richmond applied to that. If you want to go to the next slide. And so we have been working with, along with, so Richmond was one of 24 communities selected for this project, and we've been working for the last year to provide, you can see it here, research and analysis that is intended to support the city in identifying strategies to equitably transition the existing buildings in the city to clean electricity. That's a big mouthful, but I'll unpack it here in a second. I do want to say that NREL has not been working alone. So Patrick and I have been meeting regularly with a coalition of people from multiple city departments, as well as the Richmond Community Foundation. We've met with people from the Green Blue New Deal team, other stakeholders, to make sure that the work that we have been doing is meeting the community's needs. And so on this screen, and I'm going to drop a link into the chat really quickly, there is a very detailed report that was just published. It is hot off the presses that sort of details everything that we have been doing over the last year in terms of the analysis. Again, I'm going to talk about what that is. So what we're going to try to do here today is summarize that in about an hour. But just know that, every answer to every question you could possibly have is probably somewhere in this very detailed report. And we hope that you will check it out if you have some of those questions. On to the next slide. So again, sort of what exactly did we look at? So what we were trying to do was analyze the potential impacts of upgrading the existing building stock in Richmond in terms of both electrification, which you can see here on the slide. That's the adoption of technologies that use electricity in place of natural gas or other fossil fuels. So think about space heating, water heating. In homes, you also have other appliances like dryers and cooking ranges, things like that, and transitioning them from fossil-based fuels to cleaner electricity. But we also looked at what the impacts of building envelope improvements might look like. So this is measures like insulation and air sealing. And what these do is they're not electrification, but they reduce the energy needed for space heating and space cooling. And as we're going to talk about throughout this report, natural gas is the primary fuel used for those things, and it's also, has heavier emissions and things like that. So a way to decarbonize the energy used in existing buildings, and building envelope improvements are tied to that. You can go to the next slide. For those of you who are a little bit more visually oriented, this slide here may help a little bit with what I was just saying. So this is a graphic from Richmond's Zero Net Carbon Ready Homes project. And it identifies a lot of the things that I was just talking about, the insulation and the electrification of appliances. I will say it calls out other things like solar panels, battery storage, electric vehicle readiness. These were not covered in our analysis, but those can absolutely be important elements to pair with building electrification. And envelope improvements in the city has done and continues to do a lot in terms of policies and programs that can support those elements. Okay, next slide. So our analysis looked at how envelope and electrification upgrades for Richmond's existing buildings could make impacts in 4 key areas. So if you want to click there, Patrick. Oh, there we go. So the first one is environmental health. So we looked at energy consumption, which is how much energy is being used in these buildings, as well as greenhouse gas emissions related to the generation of that energy, the creation of that energy used in the buildings. And again, in Richmond, as in most parts of the countries, there's a connection between those two in terms of natural gas tends to be more polluting in terms of emissions than the sort of generation of an equivalent amount of electricity. And in Richmond and many parts in the Bay area have an even cleaner grid than a lot of other parts of the country, and that's definitely the case. We also looked at costs. So we looked at what would be the impacts of these building upgrades on utility bill costs. So which upgrades might lower or increase utility bills, for whom, by how much. We also looked at potential cost effectiveness over time for these building upgrades for residential buildings, meaning how much of the upfront cost of installing some of these measures is paid back over time in the utility bill savings that you tend to see. We also looked at sort of high-level employment impacts of implementing these upgrades. So new jobs created, existing jobs that might be able to shift from traditional measures to sort of new skills needed, and looked at the wages associated with those types of jobs. We looked at how building upgrades might impact individual health in terms of indoor air quality for Richmond residents and workers. And then I think there's one more click on this slide, Patrick. So we also made sure that we were looking at equity in each of these sections. And so I'll talk about, have a section of equity at the very end of today. I do want to just point out that residential and commercial buildings are only a very tiny slice of the pie in terms of all energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions in the city of Richmond. If anyone's familiar with the city's 2016 climate action plan, transportation and heavy industrial uses, which we did not look at in this analysis, are responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions in Richmond. So this is not a project that is intending to address all emissions in the city or even a majority of emissions, but understand that it is one piece of the puzzle. And it's one piece that has direct impacts on residents and workers in Richmond in terms of their health, in terms of what they pay in utility bills and that sort of thing. So before we dive into the a little bit more information, if you want to go to the next slide, Patrick, Omar is going to pop a poll question up into our little Zoom screens here. And we want to have a sense, before you've heard any of the data, we want to have a sense of which impact area of the ones I just talked about you think is either the most important to you or that you think the city should be focusing on. So should they look at the thing that has the highest impact on energy consumption or greenhouse gas emissions or utility bills, return on investment, number of jobs supported, quality of jobs supported, because those can all indicate different ways to approach this kind of work when it comes to actually doing it in the city. So we'll leave that up for just a second. If everybody, I see 4 responses, but I see more than 4 people in the room. So if everyone can, there we go. We're getting a little bit more. Cool. So that'll stay open for a second. If you want to go ahead to the next slide, Patrick. Thank you, everyone, for responding to that poll. We're going to ask it again later just to see if anything we have said changes anything about how you think about this. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on project methodology. Again, you can read the report and get a whole lot of detail there if that's what you want. But I do just want to mention where the majority of our data comes from. So which is these ResStock and Comstock tools you see on the screen here. So these are energy modeling tools that were developed by NREL. They are free and open to anyone to use. So we use them and they are complex, but anyone can pull data from there. And they build, as you can see here, they build on a national database of building stock characteristics, and they use high-speed computing to basically estimate energy consumption in buildings across the US. If anyone here on this call has ever had an energy audit done in their home or in their business, when someone's doing that, they're going out and they're putting in a whole bunch of information that is specific to your building and the appliances that you use, and putting into a computer system that models what your energy consumption might look like if you had a more efficient appliance, or if you insulated your walls, or whatever that is. And so ResStock and Comstock essentially are doing this for a representative sample of all buildings in the US, and you have the ability to drill down to specific geographies to see what that looks like in specific locations. So again, we didn't take everyone's utility bill data because we don't have access to everyone's utility bill data. And so we didn't base it on that. We based it on these models that are highly vetted. So going on to the next slide. One thing I do want to say, I mentioned before that we didn't look at any heavy industrial buildings. So here is a table where you can see what we did and didn't include in our analysis. So essentially, we were able to look at the vast majority, 98% or so, of residential buildings in the city of Richmond. Our analysis includes about 2/3 of the commercial and institutional building stock, which is actually about 85% of the floor area. So it's capturing the majority of the space in these commercial and institutional buildings. And then in terms of industrial buildings, we only looked at warehouse and storage buildings and not any of the heavier mid-scale and heavier industrial buildings. The main reason for that is that industrial facilities use such specialized equipment that there's not a way within the Comstock tool to like make an estimate of the special machinery that they're using in these buildings. And so anyway, just understanding what we did and what we did not include. The other thing, if you go to the next slide there, is I've been talking about building upgrades. And so I want to say what that actually means. So when we talked about building envelope upgrades, that's wall insulation, attic insulation, plus some additional air sealing foundation insulation in residential buildings. For electrification, we essentially were looking at electrification of space heating and space cooling with high efficiency and mid efficiency heat pumps. And then for residential buildings, we were also able to look at electrification of hot water heaters, of clothes dryers, and of cooking ranges. And then the next slide, I do want to just call out project limitations. So as I've said before, this analysis is based on modeled energy consumption, not actual sort of real-time data. And I will say, in terms of that question, in terms of project limitations, there was a famous scientist who said, and I use this all the time, but who said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So we, meaning NREL and the Department of Energy, believe that the ResStock and Comstock models are useful to this process and to Richmond, even if they're not 100% accurate, right? Every time you model something and model what might change if you change this or the other thing, you're making so many assumptions about everything. And the reality is that something might change. There might be a national pandemic, there might be an international global pandemic, there might be a recession, there could be something that changes. I mean, supply chain issues change the cost of things, whatever that is. There are a lot of things that can change what you model to reality, but these are highly vetted tools that we feel really confident about. As I mentioned also, our analysis doesn't include all building types or every possible building upgrade or every possible combination of building upgrades. As I mentioned before, our cost analysis and our job estimates are more high level. They weren't in-depth modeling, but they were designed to try and provide sort of an understanding of the scale of the impact that might be expected from these types of upgrades. And finally, the last piece I think is really important, that our analysis does not provide recommendations. So our intention in this project is not to tell Richmond residents or business owners or elected officials what they should do in Richmond. This project is about providing data to inform everyone here and the stakeholders I just mentioned to make more informed decisions related to building envelope and building electrification policies and programs. Next slide. Okay, so I feel like I'm already behind, so I'm going to go even faster. This project builds on a whole lot of work that's already been done in Richmond and the surrounding area over the last decade or more. So I want to draw attention to the Climate Action Plan from 2016. It calls out building envelope and electrification work specifically. In 2021, there was a ban on natural gas in new developments, right? So that was in new buildings that are being built now and in the future. And so this one is looking at existing buildings. If you go on to the next slide, there's also a whole lot that's happening at the state and regional level that is going to definitely impact what happens in Richmond. The most recent one is maybe the most interesting. Earlier this year, the Bay Area Quality Management District voted on rules to eliminate essentially eliminate gas fired space heaters, furnaces, and water heaters starting as soon as 2027. So again, understanding that things are happening just outside of Richmond. It's not only a Richmond project. And then the next slide So at the federal level, there are two major pieces of legislation in the last couple of years here, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also sometimes referred to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act, that are funneling a ton of money for building envelope and electrification upgrades to communities with a focus on low income and underserved populations. So understanding that this is a valuable time to be doing this kind of investigation. Okay, so I'm going to barrel on ahead, and in about maybe 10 minutes, we'll have a break and allow you to ask all the questions that you have before I turn it over to Patrick for more information. But I'm going to just highlight some of these high-level findings from our report. So this slide just sort of shows overall a breakdown of the residential and the commercial buildings in Richmond, the energy they consume, and the emissions associated with that energy that they consume. So you can see here that for the buildings we modeled, which again, were not every building in the city, residential buildings make up about almost 80% of the floor area of the buildings we looked at. They consume about 70% of the energy. That's both electricity and natural gas, but they're responsible for 80% of the emissions, right? And commercial is a smaller chunk that grows and shifts according to that. So the reason for that difference between sort of energy consumption and emissions, 70% versus 80%, has to do with the type of energy that these buildings are consuming. So if you remember what I said earlier, that generating natural gas emits more pollutants than generating an equivalent amount of electricity. Patrick, if you go to the next slide. So this is showing a breakdown. You see in dark green, that's natural gas. In yellow, that's electricity. So residential buildings are more reliant on natural gas than in commercial buildings. Natural gas makes up more than half of the energy used in Richmond's residential buildings, but they're only about a quarter of the energy used in commercial buildings, right? So those things look a little bit different. If you go to the next slide, this sort of explains why that difference is, and it has to do with what are the appliances that are being used that are using that energy in these buildings. So hopefully you can see these colors up on the screen, but things like the dark green and the yellow in this particular graph are space heating and water heating, right, which are heavily reliant for the most part are natural gas. There are definitely some homes in Richmond that have electric hot water heaters or electric space heating, but it's the majority is natural gas, and that makes up more than half of the energy that's used in Richmond, whereas those particular colors are much smaller, right? They're a much smaller portion of everything that's happening for commercial buildings. And the majority, like if you look at this blue chunk in the commercial buildings, the majority of energy used in commercial buildings is equipment and appliances, lighting, so think about like computers, printers, specialized machinery that may need to be used, things like that. So they use energy really differently, which means that that's going to impact the emissions associated. And it also has an impact on the upgrades that we modeled. So if you go to the next slide. Yep. So on the left, you can see we've got, this is all compared to a baseline that is 100%. You're going to see graphs similar to this as we continue on today. But when we looked at the building envelope upgrades that we modeled, we could expect to see about a 20% reduction in energy. That's the main bars here across the city, whereas high efficiency electrification upgrades could actually see about a 40%, even more than a 40% reduction in total energy consumed. And because natural gas, again, if you're with electrification and with building envelope work, right, you're reducing the amount of natural gas that's being consumed, and that's more polluting. And so as a result, you see the lines, which are those smaller lines for greenhouse gas emissions, those go down even faster, right, for both. And so if click one more time, Patrick, to just give a sense of like what this means, because this is just bars and this is just, this is relative changes. But we used the EPA's greenhouse gas equivalency calculator. And so the kind of reductions that you might see with these higher efficiency electrification upgrades, it's sort of like taking more than 16,000 gasoline-powered passenger vehicles off the road for a year. And this is just each year. Oh, my light went on because I wasn't moving. So these are annual changes. So understanding that, I said earlier, this isn't everything, but it's a lot, right? It can definitely have an impact. The other thing I do want to point out, which sort of sets things up for what Patrick's going to talk about here pretty soon, is you may notice that the light green bar here is pretty close to the same size in all three of those, and that most of the change that's happening is in the dark green, right, which is for residential buildings. And just understand that is the case, and that's because, again, as we mentioned before, the things that are most impacted by the building upgrades that we looked at are space heating and space cooling and water heating, and those are a much bigger portion of how residential buildings are currently using energy in the city of Richmond. So understand that it's not that commercial building improvements aren't going to make a change, but the scale is just very different because of how they consume energy. Okay, next slide. I'm going to give just a high-level overview of the upgrades and how they can impact employment. So there's no published data set available about how many Richmond residents work today in the energy efficiency sector, but there is a report that's put out each year by the U.S. Energy. It's called the U.S. Energy Employment Report, and the one released just a couple of months ago. There are about 8,000 energy efficiency workers in Contra Costa County. That's both residential and commercial. And this map I think is pretty cool. Contra Costa County actually has one of the highest ratios of energy efficiency workers to the overall workforce in the state, of all the counties in the state. So I think that's pretty cool. For Contra Costa County, the majority of its energy efficiency workforce is construction, but actually have pretty heavily in professional services as well. So that's architects and engineers and energy auditors and inspectors, things like that. And a lot of the work is in HVAC, which is another acronym for you: heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. So that's that's sort of this electrification work that we're talking about. There are definitely more workers doing related things in the county who could be reskilled or upskilled to sort of shift into this space if it was required. And then on the next slide. So what we did is we used sort of high-level jobs multipliers that NREL published last year to estimate, what the impact of these upgrades might look like. So for residential buildings, which is sort of this middle column here, it was estimated that about 7,500 jobs, 7,544, could be supported by the residential work, and up to 14,000 jobs could be supported by the commercial work that we're looking. That's a result of doing these upgrades at a citywide scale. We made some assumptions about which of those jobs might be new versus might be existing jobs that just require upskilling here. But this is quite a lot of jobs. Now understand that those are just jobs. So if every building in the city of Richmond had everything upgraded in 1 year, that would be all the jobs in 1 year. If it takes 20 years to do all of that work, that's far fewer jobs in each year. So this is just total jobs, and it's not saying how many jobs there will be in any given year, because that depends on how long the city decides it needs to take to realistically do this kind of work. But this at least gives you a sense of the scale of the impact that might be seen from this type of work. On to the next slide. So the last area that we look at, if you remember back to that original list of 4 impact areas, was health impact. So what we did here was we researched published studies that look at the impacts of building materials and appliances and upgrades on indoor air quality. So I'm not going to read everything in this table. You can separately if you want to, but basically there are many documented health impacts that are related to things like improperly vented natural gas combustion appliances or improperly sealed building envelopes, right? You have things like mold, you have things like carbon monoxide and other pollutants. And so those things can cause issues like respiratory irritation or the worsening of asthma symptoms or have cardiovascular impacts. And this is important if you go to the next slide, because so these are some maps from Cal Enviro Screen. The census tracts in Richmond have some of the highest rates in the state for emergency room visits related to asthma, or cardiovascular disease. Now, I want to be clear that buildings alone are not responsible for those higher rates that you see in Richmond. There are many other pollution factors that exist in Richmond and the surrounding area that contribute to this, but there are still documented health benefits that can happen as a result of improving the envelope of buildings or pursuing electrification of buildings, which I can talk about here if you want to go to the next slide. So first, building electrification, that first bullet there, has the potential to improve indoor air quality by removing pollutants that result from the incomplete combustion of natural gas appliances. So that is a documented thing where electrification can be very beneficial. Envelope improvements have also been shown to increase indoor air quality because they can, so envelope improvements, right, are insulation and air sealing. So it's tightening up a building and it's reducing the amount of air that can go in between the inside and the outside of the building. So one way it can help is if you have, if you live next to a highway, for example, right, better air sealing of your building may reduce the amount of pollutants from the outside that are coming in. You can also, if you have issues with mold, which can happen in some buildings that aren't properly sealed, so properly sealing them can eliminate or reduce things like that. However, and the third bullet is important, poorly or incompletely installed envelope measures, especially if they are not paired with adequate mechanical ventilation or things like electrification, could actually reduce air quality inside of buildings. And that has been shown in certain reports. And again, we point to all of these things in the full report and have links here, and you'll have access to this presentation soon. But particularly if natural gas appliances are still present, right? And then you seal up the building, right? So if a poorly sealed building or insulated building might have been providing natural ventilation to deal with poor indoor air quality. And if you seal that up and you don't get rid of the things that are polluting inside, you have the potential to increase or decrease air quality indoors. So just understanding that is definitely an important element to think about when developing programs or policies around some of these areas. Okay, so I'm going to hand it off to Patrick, and he's going to dig into a little bit more detail. But first, I just want to see if there are any questions that anyone has on anything that I've talked about so far. No questions. Clear as mud. Okay. All right. Well, Patrick, I'll leave it to you to talk through some of the details specific to residential and commercial.
Thank you, Allison, very much. As Allison mentioned, we're going to dig into more details around the residential and commercial energy consumption. We're going to start with the residential baseline analysis. As Allison talked about earlier, natural gas consumption is a little over 50%, while it does account for more than 80% of the emissions, and that is due to a higher emissions factor for natural gas compared to the electricity that Richmond residents receive from marine clean energy. So their electricity will have fewer emissions per kilowatt hour compared to natural gas. However, when you look at the other side of that, looking at your utility costs, electricity is going to cost more for that same amount of energy compared to a natural gas. So electricity is going to be cleaner, however, it is going to cost more for residents. And we'll get deeper into this and how this affects different upgrade scenarios in the next couple slides. First, we're going to talk about some residential buildings consumption trends that we see sort of on a per unit basis here. We are looking at single family homes, small multifamily homes, which are 2 to 4 units per building. And then we have large multifamily homes, which are 5 or more units per building. As you can see here, these single family homes are going to consume a lot more energy than multifamily homes. However, they are natural gas is going to be a larger consumer compared to electricity. And then that trend is actually flipped when you look at multifamily homes. And That is because single-family homes are going to be larger. They're going to need to heat their homes or units. And since they are larger, you're going to consume more natural gas. Whereas if you look at multifamily homes, they're going to be smaller units on a square footage basis, and so they're not going to require as much natural gas for heating measures as well. And so that is that trend in between single family and then multifamily homes. Looking at single families versus multifamilies, in Richmond, 70% of the homes are going to be a single family home. So they are going to be more dominant as you look around Richmond. And we're going to talk about how that relates into some of the equity measures, and that's going to be talked about later. This next slide, however, we're going to look at energy consumption over when the unit was built. So as you can see, pre-1940s buildings are going to consume the most energy per unit compared to any other time period that we looked at. 71% of Richmond's housing stock was built before 1980, so those are going to be the two higher consuming charts on the left. And you're also going to, there could be a couple of reasons to that, but in 1978, the California Energy Commission released their first energy code for residential buildings. That same year, the US EPA enacted bans on lead-based paint and asbestos in certain building materials. So that means homes built after 1978 are going to be after 1978 are going to be more energy efficient, and they're going to be at a less of a risk for health and safety issues. Again, when we look at homes built before 1980, most of those homes are going to be single-family homes. Whereas you look at a lot of units built since 1980 in Richmond, those are about 50-50 between multifamily and single-family homes. And then if you look at 2000 to now, the most recent homes built, there's a higher energy consumption versus those built in the 80s and 90s, and that's because homes built or housing units built now are larger, and so they're going to need to consume more energy for heating, cooling, lighting, just because there's going to be more appliances compared to older homes. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Here we're going to talk about the different upgrade scenarios that were modeled for residential buildings in Richmond. This left bar over here is our baseline energy consumption. Then you look at envelope upgrades, which we talked about were wall insulation, attic insulation, general air sealing, duct sealing. So this is going to be increasing sort of the energy efficiency of your home. Then the next two here are in electrification scenarios. We have a lower efficiency scenario and a higher efficiency. Both of these model the same appliances that are going to be upgraded. Just the efficiency between those appliances is the difference. So those four main appliances that were looked at are air source heat pumps, and a electric backup for heating, space heating, a heat pump water heater, electric dryers, and then also electric ranges and ovens, so cooking surfaces. And then this last one on the far right is going to be our envelope, so that those wall insulation, attic insulation, air sealing going to be combined with the high efficiency electrification scenarios. As you can see with electrification, our natural gas consumption goes very close to zero, and that isn't completely zero just due to some of the appliances that are modeled that aren't flip to an electric version in res stock. Next, moving on to our next slide here. This is a look at the bill changes, utility bills for residents across Richmond. So this is sort of an average of what will happen for each scenario. And then we've also brought in this black line, which is our electricity energy consumption, and then the dotted line, which is greenhouse gas emissions. And these are from the last slide. As we saw before, charges for natural gas consumption are going to go down and to nearly zero for the 3 electrification upgrades, but the charges for electricity are going to vary a lot between each scenario. And that is because electricity, one, is going to be cost more on a per unit basis than natural gas, but also you're going to be consuming more electricity for some scenarios, like this lower efficiency electrification. You're going to be consuming more electricity than you were before, and so your bill is going to increase. However, if you choose like a higher efficiency, as you can see, you do see bill savings, as well as if you keep that in with electrification, you will see a 70% of your original bill. And again, this is also an average. Just want to remind you about that. But it's also important that we talk about that it's not just whether you switch from gas to electricity, but how we do it. And it matters because lower efficiency heat pumps may be cheaper than high efficiency options in terms of upfront costs, but you also have to think about that they may lead to an increased utility bill compared to higher efficiency options over the lifetime of a measure. And then our next slide here, we're going to continue to talk about some of the costs, but this time we're going to look at the savings to investment ratio for modeled residential upgrades. So this black line here, that is going to be a 1-to-1 savings to investment ratio, or an SIR. That means 100% of the upfront cost of a measure was recouped by modeled utility bill savings over the lifetime of the measure. An SIR of more than 1, which you can see for the envelope upgrades, means that you are saved more money than your initial upfront investment. And in this case, it's over twice the amount of money saved compared to your initial investment. And then looking at these 3 different bars that we have for each one, the first one is your total cost of your upfront investment. The second one is going to be an incremental cost. So let's say you already have to replace your HVAC unit or your furnace. So if you're going to replace that with a electric heat pump, those heat pumps might cost more, but you're already going to have to put a certain amount of money in for your new furnace. So that incremental cost is looking at the difference between replacing it with what you already have. So in this case would be a natural gas furnace compared to replacing it with an electric heat pump. And then that blue bar does take into account different rebates that are available through BayREN. So those 2 other bars do not take into account the rebates that are possible. Again, looking at, since your bills do go up for your low efficiency electrification, your savings in your bill will never actually reach your investment, because that is your bills are increasing. So you're not going to save any money over time. When you look at high efficiency electrification, you don't really see a savings to investment ratio above 1 until you combine that with your incremental costs, your rebates, and an envelope upgrade for that up costs. Again, I will mention that our cost estimates were also aired on the site of higher costs. We didn't want to oversell the potential value. And the results of our estimates show that the electrification at a citywide scale may not be cost effective in terms of utility dollars. It does, as I mentioned, get close to being cost effective as you add in incremental costs and rebate programs. That is our last slide on residential energy consumption and upgrades. Are there any questions before I move on to commercial buildings? Nope, none seen. We're going to move on. Again, here for commercial baseline analysis, we're going to look at our energy consumption and our emissions. Here we're going to see the same thing. We're going to see a low natural gas consumption, but a high natural gas emissions just due to the electricity mix that's being used across Richmond. And then as well, however, when you look at this compared to residential, 77 natural gas is highly used in residential buildings for things like space heating and cooking. Those things are also applicable in commercial buildings. However, commercial buildings are going to use a lot more electricity, as I will show later, in terms of refrigeration, heat pumps, fans, plug loads, lightings, and we'll talk about that difference in terms of different building types as well later. So this next slide here, again, this is what sort of I was talking about, but natural gas consumption is not going to be the same across different types of commercial buildings. As you can imagine with food service, that natural gas consumption is going to be more than 50% of their total energy consumption because food services use natural gas for cooking as well as heating, and a large percentage of what they do is based around natural gas. While if you look at healthcare buildings like hospitals, they have a lot of machines plugged in. They have to keep certain medicines refrigerated. They're going to have a lot more plug load and lighting load as they have to operate 24/7 compared to their natural gas consumption, which might just be used for heating and cooling. So it's not the same throughout all commercial building types or throughout Richmond. This next slide here, we're going to look at the consumption, number of buildings, floor area, energy consumption, and emissions for each of those scenarios, or for each of those building types that I had mentioned on the previous slide. You can see the large number of buildings in Richmond are mercantile buildings. However, they don't account for most of the floor area just due to office spaces and warehouse or educational buildings being a large percentage of those floor areas. They are larger buildings typically. And so not always does the number of buildings relate to the floor area, and relate to the energy consumption within Richmond. As you see, food service, large energy consumption, very small floor area. And this next slide here, we are going to talk about the 2 upgrade options that we have modeled for commercial buildings. That first one is the envelope upgrades. We see a savings of around 3 to 5% in consumption of energy, and a similar sized reduction in emissions for envelope. And this is because not all energy that is used in commercial buildings is focused on space heating, and that is what your envelope is improving, is the efficiency of your space heating measures. And so the big change that you won't see a big change like you did in residential when it comes to envelope upgrades for commercial buildings. And then when we get to electrification, however, you do see a larger jump, almost 20% reduction, and then an even higher reduction in emissions. And that is because we are electrifying some of those heat pumps, fans, HVAC units that are being used, and they might be older, they might be less efficient, and the new electrified heat pumps will be more efficient in terms of energy consumption number. For commercial buildings, we weren't able to look at a combined option in Comstock, so that is not modeled here for commercial building upgrades. And then here's what I was talking about earlier in terms of end use of your energy consumption. So when you look here at the different upgrades by end use, you can see that your large portion of your energy consumption is equipment, refrigeration, things like water heating, lighting, pumps and fans. Those aren't always going to be improved with a building envelope upgrade. As you can see here, there is a reduction in space cooling and heating, and that's where most of the savings come from in a building envelope. And those savings are even increased further here with space heating, space cooling, electrification, and then you have to run your fans less if your building is more energy efficient in terms of heating and cooling. So that is where we see another savings. But for the most part, these two upgrade scenarios, you're not going to see a change in water heating, equipment, refrigeration, and lighting. So that's why the savings seen in residential aren't as great as, or are greater than the savings seen in commercial building use. So any questions on that? I see Justine asked a question. What is the list of equipment included in high efficiency equipment versus low energy efficiency residential? Yeah. Allison covered this in one of her earlier slides, but I'll run through the list real quick. Low efficiency electrification in residential homes includes a low efficiency air source heat pump and an electric resistance backup for space heating. It also includes low efficiency heat pump water heater, electrical resistance dryer, and an electric range and oven. The high efficiency electrification includes a high efficiency air source heat pump, an electric resistance backup for space heating, a high efficiency heat pump water heater, ventless heat pump dryer, and an induction range and an electric oven. And then Allison also dropped the link to our report, and that is on page 78. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to pass it back to Allison.
Thank you, Patrick. So if more questions come up, just put them in the chat. I want to make sure we leave our 30 minutes or as close to that as possible for discussion on this topic. So I don't want to shortchange equity considerations, but we'll go through this and then I'll probably skip the very last little section, which is less relevant to what we're talking about today. So if you go to the next slide, so Patrick was talking a lot about sort of the differences in energy consumption for different types of buildings. This is important with regards to residential buildings in particular because of who lives in those types of buildings. So you can see in the graphic on the left here that about 40% of low-income households live in single-family buildings, but 75% of higher income households do. And there's even a more stark contrast with the graph on the chart on the right here, right? So our models estimated that something like 90% or more than 90% of owners in Richmond live in single family homes compared to about 40% of renters. So when we're talking about single family buildings, we're also talking for the most part. About owners, we're talking about higher income households. And when we talk about multifamily buildings, we're more likely to be talking about renters and about lower income households. So understanding those trends that happen there. And so if you want to go to the next slide, Patrick, this is something that probably, hopefully is not going to be totally surprising to everyone on this call, but, you know, in general, higher income households tend to pay, Patrick was showing that they tend to pay, consume more energy, and they tend to pay more in sort of absolute dollars on their utility bills. So you can see that those are the green, dark green bars that are going across there. They tend to pay a little bit higher, but the percentage of their income that is going towards those utility bills is very, very different. So that's something that's called energy burden, that term. And so you can see that light green line, households that are below the federal poverty line in Richmond pay on average about 15% of their income on energy costs, compared to about 1% for those households on the far right of that graph that are earning more than 400% of the federal poverty level. So just understanding that these things, while we talked quite a bit about building type, because that's how the modeling tools that we have works, there are correlations to who's living in those buildings. If you go to the next slide, again, single family residents are more likely to be owners, and they're more likely to be higher income households. And as I said, you might expect to see higher utility bill reductions, not just initial payments, but the reductions that you would see from the upgrades, because they're spending more energy now. If they improve their efficiency, right, they're going to see higher rates of reductions in their utility bills than renters or lower income households would. And I'm calling this out in particular because there's this other layer that happens where not always, but often, renters, particularly those living in multifamily buildings, often pay only for their electricity, and they may not pay for their gas costs that may be covered by a landlord or a building owner. And so, you know, if our modeling is showing that low efficiency electrification, for example, could actually increase your overall bills, even if it's zeroing out the natural gas bills, you know, and there could be cases where, you know, a renter's not going to see any of the natural gas savings. They're just going to experience all of the increase in electricity bills, right? And so, anyway, there's definitely an equity concern to think about for the city when they're looking at how they want to implement policies and make requirements, particularly with things when you have issues with lower efficiency electrification of appliances. On to the next slide. Another sort of equity component has to do with the quality of jobs. So earlier we talked about the sort of quantity of jobs that might be experienced from these types of upgrades, but the quality of the job. So you can see in these columns here that commercial workers who work in commercial buildings tend to earn significantly more, 42% higher, than workers doing similar work in the residential sector, right? So that's going to have an impact on the quality of jobs there. Another thing to consider is that if you look at sort of the rows up higher, the electrical, plumbing, and HVAC contractors, they're the ones more likely to be working on electrification projects, and their incomes tend to be higher than, for example, installation contractors or residential remodelers in particular. So just again, understanding sort of equity components to differences in how the city could approach these types of upgrades from a policy or program perspective. And then the last slide here, before we sort of, I think, move into discussion. So these again came from the literature review study, but residents living in multifamily buildings may be more likely to have higher levels of indoor air pollution. And that's just because they have smaller living spaces, right? So there's sort of like less room for this stuff to go, and they have fewer exterior walls with that have windows and things that can improve ventilation naturally within their buildings. You know, and this is particularly important since multifamily residents in Richmond are also more likely to be low income. There can be increased risk for, this is again, these are national studies, these are not Richmond studies that I'm citing here, but children have been shown to have increased risk for asthma, as have women, related to exposure to some of the things that are a result of natural gas combustion appliances. And that mostly has to do with women tend to spend more time in the home than men. Children often spend more time, especially young children, are more likely to spend more time in the home than the other person, and women are spending more time cooking, which if you're doing it over a natural gas stove, if your stove is leaking, then you have those issues. You have a higher risk there. But I think, one of the biggest things, which I said before, and I'll just reiterate it one more time, is that building envelope improvements that don't have proper ventilation associated with them or electrification that's getting rid of those polluting appliances can also just make indoor air quality worse for anyone, no matter what the building or the population type. So I want to break here. If you go ahead a couple slides, Patrick. Well, let's do this. Any final questions on the equity considerations? Okay, so we asked this at the beginning. We're going to ask it one more time. Omar, poll question number 2. After hearing sort of the trade-offs that you can start to see between these different impact areas, we want to ask it again. So if you responded to the question the first time, please respond again. It's the exact same question. But which of those areas do you think that the city should focus on? And if it's the same, that is totally okay. We just want to see if anything changed. We're curious. So please respond to this poll. We're going to have a couple of polls and then some discussion questions here. But do you think that the city should focus on policies and programs that reduce energy consumption? Do you think they should focus on things that reduce greenhouse gas emissions? You have the highest impacts on utility bills, return on investment, job supported quality of jobs. So if everyone can respond to that poll right now. Keep going, people. I know we've been talking a lot. You're going to have a chance to talk here in just a second. So you can continue to think about this and to respond to the poll. We're getting 3. If everyone on this call can try to respond. The next question, if you scroll down in your poll browser that popped up, so this is the question of, we talked about envelope improvements and we talked about electrification upgrades. So for you, based on what you heard here today, do you think that the city should focus on envelope improvements, on electrification upgrades, or do you think both are really necessary? So that's question number 2, which is confusing because we've called it question number 3 in the slide. Pay attention to the poll. You can ignore the slide for now. Cool. And people are responding. This is great. The third question, and people are responding to all of them. So this is great. So do you think that the city should focus on or prioritize residential buildings, commercial buildings, or both? And it looks like we have residential buildings as winning. Awesome. Well, I know that there are a few people on this call who haven't responded. If you're able to respond to that poll, we would appreciate that. But what we're going to do now is, if you click to the next slide, Patrick. So we were going to do breakout room questions. I feel like we've lost some of the people that were initially in this call. I know it was a long call. So I think we're just going to stay in one big room, and I'm going to open this up. And so we have 5 questions here that we've put out, and I'll go through them. But I want anyone that's on the call to respond to whichever one speaks to you. What was your biggest takeaway, or what was the thing that you heard that most surprised you, or has maybe changed your thinking about something? Question number 2. So we asked about sort of like, do you think we should focus on building upgrades, or what types of buildings? But are there certain specific types of buildings, multifamily versus single family? Or are there certain populations, owners versus renters, or something like that, that you think the city should focus on? The third question has to do, I'm going to go through all these and then I just want to open it up, is if you know, or if you have ideas for resources that might make programs that the city develops easier for either residents or building owners in general. We want to talk about those and hear those ideas from you. We want to know about concerns that you might have. So if there was anything that you heard that you think the city absolutely should or should not something, we want to know what those concerns are, and then just generally, what other questions do you have? So we'll leave these questions on the screen. And I would just love to hear from anybody that's here still in the room, just what your thoughts and reactions are to everything that we talked about today. And you can raise your hand, or you can just start talking, or you can put things in the chat. I will say, if nobody talks, I will volunteer you, and I will call you out by name, because we really want to hear what people think. Okay, Justine, I'm going to single you out because I know you have thoughts on this. Justine, if you can hear me and come off mute and open up your video, I would love to have, if you have any thoughts in response to any of these 5 questions.
Allison and your group, Allison, Patrick, everybody, thank you so much. This is really helpful to inform the Richmond Green Blue New Deal. So I skimmed the report and the slides ahead of time, and then you went through them. My takeaway is that building envelope improvements and low energy efficiency equipment in the residential sector the arrows seem to be pointing towards that. Did I miss? I know you're not making recommendations. You're giving us the data analysis rolled up from all these great sources. Is that the takeaway I should be getting out of this? That building envelope and lower energy efficiency equipment in residential applications is the place to focus?
So I think the hard part here is that it depends on what your priority is, because if your priority, and this is where we want to just get everyone's opinion, and there's not a right or wrong opinion on this because there just isn't. But we want to, so if your priority is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that is what you think should be the most important consideration, right? Then that would say focus on residential buildings, not commercial buildings. And it would say, what is the biggest bang for your buck is going to be the higher efficiency electrification, for example. If what you care about is the return on investment for residents, envelope had the biggest return on investment there, right? If what you care about is the quality of the jobs and the wages associated with those jobs, well, then commercial building electrification had the highest sort of the highest wages associated with them compared to some of the other ones. So I think it really, like, there is no answer to that unless you know what is the highest so this is why we were asking some of the questions of what do you think city council should prioritize, because we want to know that can help them sort of weight the outcomes of these different things. But I think low efficiency electrification was the one area where you might actually see increases in utility bills versus everything else. You saw some level of decreases in utility bills. So that was a sort of a big finding, I think there in terms of that low efficiency electrification. Even though energy consumption decreased, bills went up because electricity is more expensive relative to natural gas.
Does your model allow for the city of Richmond to choose more than one priority, or did they just have to choose one and set all the others aside in order to decide what to focus on? Because ROI is important and jobs are important and greenhouse gases are important.
Yeah. So again, we our modeling just had to do with the energy consumption patterns, and everything else was sort of layered on top of that. So again, if you some of them point to the same things and some of them point to different things. And so I think it is possible. So part of the work, and Omar is going to talk in a couple minutes here about next steps, but essentially the city staff that have been involved in this project over the last year are going to take the findings from the report, feedback from stakeholders, and they are going to present some recommendations to City Council about policy or program directions. And so that's where, I think you can say, the thing that is most important is lowering utility. I mean, city staff don't want to speak for the community, right? And so I know the Green Blue New Deal has done some surveying of community members, and it's done some engagement in that way. And we're trying to hear from people today. But absolutely, you can combine them, but they may not all point to the same thing. And that may be, so I didn't get to it, but one section I was going to talk about was how this is being done in other cities. And some cities are saying we want the biggest change in emissions, and therefore we're going after, large commercial buildings, for example. Some say we want to really focus on people and how it's going to impact their pocketbook in terms of utility bills, and they focus on small scale residential. Other cities have said it's all important. We're going to look at everything and we're going to do everything. And so I think that is definitely a possibility for the city of Richmond, is if everything is important, then everything is important. But hearing from people on this call about what you think is more valuable is going to be very important to help inform what city council decides to do with this.
And to
Great,
your
thank you.
point, the path is to have a greener environment, to make sure that all of our efforts are centered on the environment. And we take into consideration the environmental implications of each project. It's just the pathway to get there varies. So these work sessions like this help us guide next steps and what is priority for the community. So that way we can take that into consideration and maybe prioritize each component that are highlighted during these sessions.
Thank you, Omar. So does anyone want to maybe talk about, I know we did the poll so that it was anonymous, but if anyone has really strong feelings about things that should absolutely be considered by city council or prioritized by city council, I would love to hear that in your words and not just in a poll number. Okay. Well, I'll ask one more question, and then I feel like people are probably needing to get onto something else, which is understandable. As I said, this was a long meeting. But again, has anybody done in any of their work, has anybody thought about things that might make it easier? Think of yourself as a resident, and if you were suddenly either required or incentivized to make some sort of change, right? If your furnace goes out and there's a mandate or a suggestion, and I don't know that this is the direction things will go. I'm just trying to think through scenarios to get people talking here. But if there were a policy that required, just as new buildings must now be all electric. So if there was some sort of policy for existing buildings, and you had to replace your furnace and now you have to do it with a heat pump, like what sorts of things would make that easier for you? Are there any ideas from the group here about things that you think might make it easier to implement policies or programs in Richmond, whether it's for residents or for commercial building owners? Okay, well, I'm going to do one thing really quickly because we have a little bit of time here, and then we'll close out and give everyone about 10 minutes left. Can you go back, Patrick? I'm going to spend just a quick down, keep going forward. Sorry. One more, there we go. So the different cities, yeah. So this is the sort of thing that I referenced, but I'm going to go ahead and just put it out there before we sign off. But again, sort of what does existing building electrification look like in other cities? So what could it maybe look like in Richmond? So as I mentioned, so Ithaca, New York sort of made waves a few years ago when they said we're going to electrify every building in the city and we're going to do it by 2030, which is a fairly ambitious plan. Granted, they have only 6,000 buildings. It's a relatively small city, but still a pretty major undertaking for something that's citywide. And the way that they did it was they contracted with an organization called Block Power that's both helping with the financing of it, training people to do the work, and then doing the work. And so just understanding that's sort of one way you can do it is we need to electrify everything and we need to do it really quickly. The next example I gave was in the city of Denver. And again, their focus was they used the tool of their building code and fire code, and basically said starting in 30, I think is the year there, that the requirement will be if in commercial or large multifamily buildings, if gas powered, space heaters or water heating appliances go out, it's now required that you replace it with an electric option, a heat pump option, a higher efficiency option. So again, that was like a very different way to approach it, and it had a different goal, which is about reducing energy consumption. And so that was sort of a bigger bang for your buck if energy consumption is your priority. And then Berkeley, the city of Berkeley, which is just down the road from everyone here, their focus was on small scale residential buildings that are 4 stories or less. And so again, just understanding that, the city has a lot of choices ahead of them in terms of how they want to do it, what they want to focus on, what they want to prioritize, and none of them is wrong. There are also cities out there that are just focusing on municipal buildings, that are, doing these things through incentives versus mandates. I mean, there's, again, just many, many ways these can be crafted. And a final thing that NREL will be offering to the city in the next couple of months will be some case studies that describe some of those policy and programs in other communities. So just understanding that is one last piece that wasn't included in this particular report, but will be delivered. Okay, there was one message. I want to make sure that Carlin. I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly, but I appreciate that comment. So Omar is going to, maybe Omar, do you want to put the link to your survey in the chat real quick?
Yes.
If you have it. So we'll sign off here and give everyone 10 minutes of their lives back. But Omar is going to send up a follow-up email. He'll drop the same thing in the chat. The report that this is based on, the slide deck and the recording from today are all going to be posted on the city's webpage for this particular project, which I can pull up too, and I'll pop in the chat here in just a second. But that'll be posted hopefully by tomorrow. If not by the end of the week. So if you have other people that weren't able to make it here today, or if you want to go back and review anything, please, those will be available to you. But there is also a survey, and there's a link right there, and you'll get an email about this. But if you have thoughts, right, we gave you a whole lot of information, and if you need time to process, you can respond to this survey over the next few days and give any answers to any of the questions that we asked here at the end, and we would love to hear that response. And again, if you know other people that may want to hear about this, you can share the links with them. You can, like I said, put your name in the chat if you want to keep hearing more about this. For example, if you want to learn about the city council date or stay involved with any of that. Omar, do you have anything final before we part?
Yeah, so Allison already went over it, but next steps are for us to incorporate your thoughts and feedback into the report. In the meantime, we are developing a presentation that will be provided to City Council that is tentatively scheduled for October 24th. So I will send out an email with the links to the documents that we reviewed during this meeting. And the survey has already been posted in the chat. It will expire within 72 hours, so we do recommend you complete it soon. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time today. We look forward to hearing anything else. If you have any other thoughts, you can email us or respond in that survey. And otherwise, I hope you all have a good rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.